This is a special expanding episode of The Sound of Politics. The first part is recorded before the first Trump-Harris televised presidential debate. And then the second part will be a reaction to that debate recorded after it happens. So make sure that you follow the podcast and you'll be notified when the next part is here.
I'm not going to answer the question.
Why would you answer that question?
The question is, the question is,
Justice, radical left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your list, Joe?
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking. I'm speaking. If you don't mind letting me finish, we can then have a conversation, okay?
Please.
Okay.
Well, we're not afraid of weird people. We're a little bit creeped out, but we're not afraid.
We did it. We did it, Joe. You're going to be the next president of the United States.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman. Election Special.
In 1960, John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon took part in the first ever televised presidential debate. It was actually quite a sober event. Two seemingly reasonable politicians talking about what they thought would be the best policies for the United States of America.
In the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln said the question was whether this nation could exist half slave or half free. In the election of 1960, and with the world around us, the question is whether the world will exist half slave or half free, whether it will move in the direction of freedom, in the direction of the road that we are taking, or whether it will move in the direction of slavery. I think it will depend in great measure upon what we do here in the United States, on the kind of society that we build.
I costed out the cost of the Democratic platform. It runs a minimum of $13.2 billion a year more than we are presently spending to a maximum of $18 billion a year more than we're presently spending. Now, the Republican platform will cost more, too. It will cost a minimum of $4 billion a year more, a maximum of $4.9 billion a year more than we're presently spending. Now, does this mean that his program is better than ours? Not at all. Because it isn't a question of how much the federal government spends. It isn't a question of which government does the most. It's a question of which administration does the right thing.
Well, at least they engaged with one another's arguments. 64 years later, when Donald Trump confronted Joe Biden in the first of that year's televised presidential debates, one could be forgiven for thinking that this was a recording of a skirmish in a late-night bar.
Well, I took 2 tests, cognitive tests. I aced them, both of them, as you know. We made it public. He took none. I'd like to see him take one, just one, a real easy one. Like go through the first 5 questions. He couldn't do it. But I took 2 cognitive tests. I took physical exams every year. And, you know, we knock on wood wherever we may have wood, that I'm in very good health. I just won 2 club championships, not even senior, 2 regular club championships. To do that, you have to be quite smart. On January 6th, we had a great border. Nobody coming through, very few. On January 6th, we were energy independent. On January 6th, we had the lowest taxes ever. We had the lowest regulations ever. On January 6th, we were respected all over the world. All over the world, we were respected. And then he comes in, and we're now laughed at. We're like a bunch of stupid people. That's why you had no terror at all during my administration. He's willing to, as we say, rip the baby out of the womb in the 9th month and kill the baby. Nobody wants that to happen.
So what can we expect from the Harris-Trump debate, which at the time of recording is just over a week away? Well, here's a test that you can apply to that election debate, indeed to any election debate you care to watch, with a view to evaluating its quality. There are just 4 questions for you to answer. You can answer them by conducting scrupulous content analysis if you want to do it in a scholarly manner, but otherwise you can just try to arrive at a general impression of each candidate in relation to the 4 questions I'm putting. Question 1. How much do each of the debaters focus on clearly stated, well-explained policies? A lot or a little? You answer that for Trump, you answer that for Harris. You don't have to agree with their policies or even fully understand them. The question is, are they talking about policy? Question 2. How much do each of the debaters make ad hominem remarks against the other debater? That is to say, attacks on their character or personality, name-calling. A little or a lot? Answer for each candidate. Question 3. How much do each of the debaters make misogynistic or racist comments? A lot or a little? Question 4. How much do each of the debaters make dubious or unsubstantiated claims? A lot or a little for each candidate? Now, if the answer is a lot to question 1, the debater is doing pretty well. We want them to talk about policy. But if the answer is a lot to questions 2, 3 or 4, then the debater is doing badly, at least in democratic terms. They're not doing what we need to hear from a debate. Well, I'm going to be scoring both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump in their forthcoming debate. And we'll record an extra part of this episode exploring what I found. So if you're listening to this episode before the debate, do come back after it to compare your scores with mine. But in the meantime, I want to go back to that recent debate between Biden and Trump and ask how US presidential debates have descended to such a low point, how political speech within them has degraded incrementally, so that we begin to accept as normal that which only a few years ago would have seemed outrageous and quite unacceptable. And to explore those questions, I'm speaking today to Professor Alan Schroeder, whose book, Presidential Debates, 50 Years of High-Risk TV, I highly recommend to you. Alan, it's great to have you with us today, and I want to start with this question. What do you think televised presidential debates add to electoral democracy in the United States?
Well, I think they add a dimension that does not otherwise exist, because our campaigns are so choreographed and so packaged and so careful. And the whole point, in some ways, of a presidential campaign is to minimize risk and to keep the candidate safe. So when you get into a live television setting like a debate is, and particularly in front of tens of millions of viewers, all of those safety nets vanish. And it's just the candidate, his opponent, and whoever is asking the questions. And it sort of strips away all of those layers of insulation that exist between candidates and the voters. For that reason, and because it's the only thing like that during the campaign, I think debates have tremendous value. It's the power of the unexpected. It's the inadvertent message. And there's nothing else like that in any form of political communication.
That's really interesting. Now, coming to this year's debates and recent debates, how does the presence of a completely anomalous political figure like Donald Trump change that picture? Can we think about presidential debates in the same way when he's present? What does his style of debating do to that as a democratic project?
Well, anomalous is definitely the word we're looking for here, because he defies so many norms and so many expectations and so many decades of tradition, not only vis-a-vis debates, but the whole political process in general. He's in some ways the figure that I've always worried about once I began studying debates. You know, when Kennedy and Nixon debated for the first time in 1960, a lot of sober-minded people were sort of horrified by the spectacle of all of that. And the thought was that a candidate who was either just a performer but had no substance, or was tremendously good looking but then had nothing to offer beyond that, that someone like that would triumph and sort of subvert the process by being good in ways that weren't necessarily beneficial to the voters. And so Trump in some ways is the embodiment of that, just because he is a television creature. You know, a critic for the New York Times once wrote this line that I thought was so on target, and that is that Trump and television share the same brain. They're wired exactly the same way. It's all about getting attention and the short-term reaction. So Trump, by being Trump and by being a performer but not a politician, really throws the whole question of debates into a different kind of frame, and one that points out the dangers of debates, as well as, you know, whatever benefits they may have. We see how a candidate like him can use that live platform to his advantage.
Now, I completely understand this idea of Trump as a television performer, but I guess my question is, he's more than that. He's somebody who defies rules of decency, of veracity, and those, I think, are not partisan observations, but objective observations. And given that's the case, I wonder how, and whether it's been incremental, this has become acceptable to the generally rather sensible and moderate-minded and morally-minded American population. And just before I let you answer that, I'm thinking about the work of Victor Klemperer, who wrote about the normalization of indecent language in Germany in the 1930s, and the way in which incrementally something that at first would not have been tolerated for a moment became tolerable because people hadn't quite noticed it creeping up on them. I wonder whether the Trump phenomenon has been a bit like that.
I do think so. I think there's been a coarsening of the public discourse in general. I think things that would once have seemed outrageous, even just a few years ago, no longer carry that same stigma. However, there's a counter argument, and that is that candidates who have tried to emulate Trump or have tried to out Trump have not had the same success as him. And in fact, in many cases, it has backfired. You know, I'm thinking of in the US here, Senate candidates, governor candidates who just refuse to debate their opponents, period, which Trump has also done at points along the way. So even though it has worked for him, and even though it has lowered the level of discourse generally, I think there's still a danger in it for anyone who comes at it as just a strategy, as opposed to that's just organically who they are. I mean, Trump is Trump because he can't help it. That's the only thing he can do. But others who try to capitalize on his success or repeat it in some way are having to kind of cast themselves into the part, and it doesn't come naturally. And I think it's that, especially in debates, it's one's ability to be true to oneself, and that viewers and audiences have a pretty good sense of when someone is faking it. So these wannabe tin pot versions of Trump just aren't having the same level of success as he has. That said, I do agree with your general premise that we accept things now that we didn't used to.
No, but that's a fascinating analysis, and a very reassuring one, in the sense that there is a particular kind of authenticity that has to be combined with this indecency that makes it palatable, and that's fascinating. So, simple question, because we like simple questions here. What's the antidote to this, Alan? I mean, what is it that a candidate coming to you and asking, how do we take on this guy in a television debate, which you have studied so much, how do I deal with him?
You know, it's been really tough to crack that code. His Republican opponents never figured it out. And not only didn't figure it out, but were scared to death of him. And that fear was palpable in those Republican primary debates, particularly back in 2016 is what I'm really thinking of here. Hillary Clinton didn't figure out how to crack the code. And she is nobody's fool. And somebody who had debated, Barack Obama and John Edwards and all sorts of talented people on the stage. Biden in 2020 did a better job of anticipating what might happen and the chaos that just, sort of travels with Trump wherever he goes. But even so, he wasn't a perfect foil. I think what's been interesting about Kamala Harris, and will be very interesting to see in her debate performance, is this idea of using joy and positivity and just the idea of goodness, as a political concept and as a messaging tool. That, if anything, has seemed to deflate Trump more than the straight-on attacks. You can't fight someone like Trump with logic because it's all just raw emotions and insults, but you can sort of point out, I think, and Harris and her running mate Tim Walz have done a good job of this. You can point out that difference between despair and dystopia and hope and a better society. Yeah. So that seems to have worked for them so far. We'll see in a debate, which is of course a different creature.
I suppose there's that saying, isn't there, that misery loves company. And in a sense, if you don't give it company and you starve it of company, it's an interesting strategy, as you say. Is there something the moderators can do? I have a kind of thought in the back of my head that this is where Britain and America are quite different. We don't have the First Amendment. We have kind of Auntie BBC who is allowed to sort of slap politicians on the wrist and tell them to behave better. And am I right in thinking that it would not be easy to design a debate format, formally or informally, in the United States, where moderators could just say, you're not allowed to do this kind of thing?
Yes, it is difficult for cultural reasons, as you indicate there. But also, I think you never want a debate to be about the moderators and the moderators' attempt to shape the conversation. It really does need to be about the candidates, for better, for worse. But I completely agree with your observation about that difference. When I've been in Britain during election seasons and watched the coverage, to me, it's just wonderful. I love the absolute unwillingness of British journalists to allow the politicians to get away with anything. I mean, some politician will give some ridiculous answer and the journalist will say, well, that's just a load of rubbish, isn't it? And, no American journalist would ever dare to do that. There's too much deference in our political journalism, in my opinion.
Why is that?
Why is that? Some of it is that our journalism emphasizes a culture of access. And in order to have access to politicians, you can't piss them off too much, or you get banished and blacklisted and your question never gets answered again. And so there's that. It's also just a difference in the tradition. I mean, I think Americans aren't always as frank. We maybe have that reputation, but when it comes to confrontation, that's not really part of the norm, and particularly in political journalism, and particularly in national political, like Washington-based journalism. They're really terrified of being on the outside looking in, and the way you stay on the inside is not to challenge too much.
So, a final question about televised debates. Let's imagine that we were going to start all over again, reinvent them. After all, 1960 is a long time ago, and if most radio stations and TV channels aren't doing things the way they did things in the 1960s. And if I was going to reinvent them, I'd probably go to Alan Schroeder and say, this is a guy who knows more about these things than most people. What should they look like? I mean, how could we run televised debates?
Well, back in 1960, when the American broadcast networks did the Kennedy-Nixon debates, they did not want to use the word debate. They thought that was a problem. They wanted to call them discussions. But the journalists of that era came up with the term debate, and that's what we're with all, ever since. But that's part of the problem, I think, is that people, when we hear the word debate, we expect this particular thing, and that's really not what it is. It is a televised discussion. Now, I think there's something sort of classic about the structure of a debate that doesn't lend itself to change. I mean, it's always going to be 2 or 3 people on a stage and somebody asking questions. You can do a lot of things around the margins to maybe update it. But as far as ideas for improving, one of the false tests of a debate is that presidents, prime ministers, national leaders anywhere don't operate in isolation. So it might be interesting to have a team debate or have a candidate on stage with a couple of advisors that could huddle. I think it would be really interesting to see a debate that was a case study, the kinds of things they do in business school, the kind of thing I did when I was in grad school, where you just spend a couple of hours playing with a scenario that's been laid out for you. And it shows people how your mind works, or whether your mind works. It shows people how you communicate. So that might be kind of an interesting way to do it. I've always been really interested in the French model, which is basically the candidates, there are moderators there, but the moderators do very little. It's basically the candidates set the tone. They use the time as they see fit. And the time is equalized by the moderators, but there aren't, sort of questions and topics per se that interrupt the flow of it. So you get this really interesting conversational dynamic, this back and forth between the candidates, which, as I say, is where the focus ought to be. So there are some things like that you could do. I think the town hall debate has actually been a great innovation, and you do those very well in the UK. I'm always so impressed by the level of questioning of the audiences, the British audiences in debates. But I don't think you want to tinker too much with that basic idea of candidates answering questions or candidates addressing a topic. If you start throwing in a lot of bells and whistles and production things, and you stop to go online to see how people are reacting to it, I don't know. I think that somehow detracts from the essence of what a debate ought to be.
I hope the networks are listening, because there's some interesting ideas there. Alan, it's been a great joy. As I predicted, there is no one better to talk about these matters, and we're all going to be watching, outside of the United States, these debates with enormous interest, because the results matter to us as well. So thank you very much for your really great insights.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you, Stephen.
This is a special, expanding episode of The Sound of Politics. I'll be recording more of this episode after the debate, so make sure you follow the podcast to be notified when the next part is here. And don't forget those 4 questions. It'll be interesting to see how you score them, how your scores compare with mine, and what we think they all mean. So come back after the debate and let's have a look at those.
I'm not going to answer the question.
Why would you answer that question?
The question is
Justice, radical left. Will you shut up, man? Listen, who is on your list, Joe?
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking. I'm speaking. If you don't mind letting me finish, we can then have a conversation, okay?
Please.
Okay.
But we're not afraid of weird people. We're a little bit creeped out, but we're not afraid.
We did it, Joe. You're gonna be the next president of the United States.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.